Forgotten Soldier, page 117. 117, chapter 4, Leave, page 117. On a beautiful spring day, we were assembled at Trefta, where Hals had spent such an enjoyable time. Two other companies joined us on a hillside covered with short, velvety grass, the kind which thrusts up so thickly that each blade seems to be fighting for space, and which becomes a tall savanna within a month. There were about 900 of us. A group of officers standing on the platform of a half-destroyed truck addressed us from the top of the hill. About 20 flags and regimental pennants had been propped around the base of the truck. The speeches were courteous. They were even congratulatory for our attitude in the past, an attitude which made us feel ashamed whenever we heard any bulletins from the front. We stared at the officers with enormous eyes. They said that because of our attitude, they were prepared to honor any one of us who might wish it by transferring him to a combat unit. About 20 men volunteered at once. The officers, recognizing our timidity, tried to put us at ease and went on talking in the same style. Certain heroic actions were described in details. 15 more volunteers stepped out of the rank, among them Lenson, who was clearly born for trouble. Next, the officers mentioned a fortnight's leave, which produced at least 300 volunteers. Then several lieutenants stepped down from the platform. They threaded their way through our ranks, selecting individual men and inviting them to take the 3 fateful steps forward, while a captain maintained the tone of eloquent pressure. The men chosen were always amongst the largest, healthiest, strongest. Suddenly, an index finger sheathed in black leather was pointing like a barrel of a Mauser rifle into the ribs of my best friend, my war brother. As if hypnotized, Hals took 3 large steps, and the sounds of his heels as he snapped them together was like a door slamming shut. A door which threatened to separate me, perhaps forever, from the only real friend I had ever made, and from the friendship which was my only incentive for life in the midst of all this despair. After a moment's hesitation, I joined the group of volunteers without any further pressure. I looked confusedly at Hals, whose face was glowing like the face of a child who has just been given a delightful surprise and who doesn't know what to say. Henceforth, my identification would be Gefreiter Sajer, G, 100, 1010 G4, Sibsanzis Battalion, Leichte Infanterie, Groß Deutschland Division, Süd, J. In the evening, we went back to the squalid shelters we had already occupied. Nothing seems to have changed. The fact that our names had been added to the infantry recruitment list was the only difference between the life we had led yesterday as truck drivers and our new life as combat troops. We felt somewhat confused as to the attitude we should adopt, but our non-coms allowed us very little time for meditation. They kept us busy cleaning up and restoring to good condition the weapons which had taken a beating during the last battle, a job which took several days. Everything seemed to have quieted down, although strong Soviet counter-thrusts had started several fires to the northeast at Slavyansk, We were also used to the revolting chore of burying the thousands of men who had died in the Battle of Kharkov. We were officially designated Burial Squad one morning at dawn. The light was so faint it was still almost as dark as the middle of the night. Laos informed us that our new job would take the place of the fortnight leave we had been promised. And we were so much looking forward to it. As a rule, the Russian prisoners were used to bury the dead, but it seemed that they had taken to robbing the bodies, stealing wedding rings and other pieces of jewelry. In fact, I think the poor fellows, many of them wounded but designated fit for work, were probably going over the bodies for something to eat. The rations we gave them were absurd. For example, 1 3-quart mess tin of weak soup for every 4 prisoners every 24 hours. On some days, they were given nothing but water. Every prisoner caught robbing a German body was immediately shot. There were no official firing squads for the executions. An officer would simply shoot the offender on the spot or hand him over to a couple of toughs who were regularly given this sort of job. Once, to my horror, I saw one of the thugs tying the hands of 3 prisoners to the bars of a gate. When his victims had been secured, he stuck a grenade in the pocket of one of their coats, pulled the pin, and ran for shelter. The 3 Russians, whose guts were blown way out, screamed for mercy until the last moment. Although we had already met birds of every color, these proceedings revolted us so much that violent arguments broke out between us and these criminals every time. They invariably became furious and abusive, shouting insults at us. They said they had escaped from the camp at Tomvos, where the Russians dumped German prisoners, and they told us how our countrymen were being slaughtered. According to them, at the infamous Tomvos camp, 60 miles east of Moscow, was an extermination camp. Rations, as ludicrous as those we handed out to Russian prisoners at Kharkov, were served once a day to men reporting for labor. Men who did not work received nothing. 1 bowl of millet was provided for every 4 men. There was never enough, even for the prisoners who could work. The daily surplus were simply killed. A favorite method of execution was to hammer an empty cartridge case into the nape of the prisoner's neck. It seemed that the Russians distracted themselves with this sort of sport. I myself can well believe that the Russians were capable of this kind of cruelty, after seeing them at work among the pitiful columns of refugees in East Prussia. But Russian excesses don't in any way excuse us for the excesses by our own side. War always reaches the depths of horror because of idiots who perpetuate terror from generation to generation on the pretext of vengeance. We spent hours digging out a long tunnel which had been turned into an emergency hospital during the fighting. The surgeons had been so overloaded that the wounded had almost certainly been abandoned. A line of rough triple-decker buses extended some hundreds of yards down the corridor, each containing 3 blackened, stiff, and mutilated bodies. From time to time, an empty space marked the final flight of a dying man. There's no light in this charnel house, except for the electric torches which some of us had fastened to our tunics. These threw beams of horrifying illumination on the thin, swollen faces of the cadavers, which we had to pull out with hooks. Finally, one delicious spring morning, incongruous in that sad ruined landscape, a muddy truck drove down the track to the new barracks we had moved into the day before. After a brisk half-turn, it stopped about 10 yards from the first building, where a group of men, which included myself, were busy removing a heap of gravel and small stones. The back flap of the truck was kicked open, and a plump little corporal jumped down and clicked his heels. Without saluting or saying a word, he rummaged in his right breast pocket, where all military instructions were supposed to be kept. He pulled out a sheet of paper which had been carefully folded 4 times and read out a long list of names. As he read, he indicated with a wave of his hand that the men named should step to the right. There are about 100 names on the list, among them Ollensheim, Lenzen, Hals, and Sajer. Me. Feeling somewhat anxious, I joined the group on the right. The corporal told us we had 3 minutes to climb aboard the truck with our weapons and packs. Then he clicked his heels again, saluting this time, and turned his back without another word, striding off as if he were suddenly going for a walk. We ran frantically to collect our things. There was no time for conversation. 3 minutes later, 100 breathless soldiers were packed into trucks whose bulging sides threatened to collapse. The corporal was also on time. He threw a withering glance at the eccentrically bulging pack some of us were carrying, but said nothing. Then he bent down to look at something under the truck. "No more than 45 on board," he barked. "Departure in 30 seconds. He took another 100 paces. We all groaned silently. No one wanted to get down. Everyone had the best of reasons for staying put. 2 or 3 men were shoved off the back. As I was right in the middle, packed in like a sardine, there was no question of moving. Laos finally took matters in hand. He made half the men of the truck get down. The remainder came to exactly 45. The corporal, who was already climbing into the front seat, told the driver to start. Laos gave us a friendly wave. We had received our final orders from him. His last smile more than made up in our eyes for all the duties he had imposed on us. Beside him, the other half of the group, called out by the corporal, watched with dazed faces as we vanished in a whirl of dust. This half of the group joined us 4 days later, 100 miles behind the front lines at the rest camp of the famous Großdeutschland Division. A large part of the division, especially the convalescing wounded, occupied the rustic Achtirka camp. The division itself held a mobile sector in the vast Kursk-Belgorod region. Everything in the camp was clean and neatly organized, as in the Boy Scouts, only far more lavishly supplied. Achtirka reminded me of an oasis surrounded by the trackless steppe. We jumped down at the corporal's order and lined up in double file. A captain, a first lieutenant, and a feldfebel walked toward us. Our plump little corporal snapped to attention. These officers were all dressed with astonishing style. The Hauptmann captain looked like a figure from a costume party, in a jacket of fine gray-green cloth with red facings of a combat unit, dark green riding breeches, gleaming cavalry boots. He waved at us and then said something we couldn't quite hear to the feldfebel, which was every bit his equal in elegance. After a short conversation with the Hauptmann captain, the Feld walked over to us, clicked his heels, and addressed us in a tone which at least was more agreeable than that of the corporal who had come to fetch us. "Welcome to the Großdeutschland Division," he shouted. "With us, you will experience a genuine soldier's life, the only life which brings men close to each other in terms of absolute sincerity. Here, a sense of comradeship exists between each and every one of us, which might be put to the test at any moment. Any black sheep, anyone unsuited for comradeship, does not stay in this division. Everyone must be able to count on everyone else without any qualification whatsoever. The slightest error on anyone's part affects the whole section. We want no slackers and no strays. Everyone must be prepared either to obey without question or to give orders. Your officers will think for you. Your duty is to show yourselves worthy of them. You will now get yourself some new clothes and throw away your stinking rags. Absolute cleanliness is the essential foundation for a decent frame of mind. We do not tolerate any sloppiness of appearance. He took a deep breath and then continued. When these preliminaries have been accomplished, this group of volunteers will receive their passes for the fortnight's leave which has been promised them. If there is no counter order, these passes will become effective in 5 days when the convoy leaves for Niedergalof. You may now proceed, Heil Hitler! It was a beautiful day. Everything in the camp seemed to be efficiently organized. According to what we just heard, one did not trifle with orders. But that seemed a reasonable change after the universe of shit and horror and suffering and panic we had just come from. And then there were our passes? Halls was jumping with delight. Like a young goat, everyone was overjoyed. Our plump corporal had one more nasty surprise in store for us, but we were all in such good humor nothing could ruffle us. He ordered us to wash our filthy clothes before turning them into the supply store where we would draw new ones. We found ourselves transformed into washerwomen, standing stripped to the skin in front of long troughs. Our underclothes were caked with filth, beyond hope of recovery. I kicked my shorts in the air and tore the undershirt into shreds. My last pair of socks, which I'd been wearing since the beginning of the retreat, were nothing but holes and joined my shorts. Then, stark naked, we walked across the grass to the store to hand in our old clothes, which were soaking wet but neatly folded, and received new ones. 2 women soldiers nearly choked with laughter when they saw us coming. "Hang on to your boots," shouted the sergeant, who was not particularly amused by the sight of naked boys. "No new boots here." We were given a fresh issue of everything from caps to first aid kits. However, certain indispensable items were missing among these underpants and socks, which in the long run proved to be serious omissions. But our spirits were too high to be disturbed at this time. When we were dressed, we were directed to a wooden army barrack. A notice in large legible characters was tacked beside the door to remind us of the cleanliness which was officially obligatory. Ein Laus der Tod, which means in German, a louse means death. The plump little corporal who had accompanied us from Kharkov waved us inside. We looked curiously around our new room, which was rough but impeccably clean. "Ruhe, Mensch!" shouted the corporal. We instantly fell silent. "Since there isn't a non-com here, I'm going to put one of you in charge." He worked his way through our ranks with his eyes half closed, as if he wished to surprise his choice, which of course would not want the responsibility, or as if the decision were somewhat significant. Finally, with a sharp cry, he selected a fellow who didn't seem to have anything really special about him. "You!" The man he pointed to stepped forward. "Your name?" "Feiderbeck." "Feiderbeck, until further notice, you will be responsible for the order of this room. You will go to the Fahrenlager to pick up the divisional patches, which everyone must sew on his left sleeve. You will also..." He enumerated a list of duties, each of which made poor Feiderbeck's head droop a little bit lower with each that he heard. A few minutes later, we each received the famous insignia of the Grossdeutschland division, with its divisional title in silver Gothic letters on a black ground. This band remained on my sleeve until 1945. When the rumor ran through our scattered ranks that the Americans were shooting any man wearing a divisional name instead of a number. And at that moment of hasty judgment, they might very well have shot a nobody from the Grossdeutschland or the Brandenburg as easily as a hero from the Leibstandarte or the Totenkopf. But that time was still very far in the future. We were then in the spring of 1943 on the territory of a conquered country. The weather was marvelous, and as a finishing touch, we all had 2-week passes in our pockets. After everything we had been through, this new life seemed like a dream. Except for morning and evening roll call, we were free to wander about and entertain ourselves as we pleased. Aktirka was a curious place. Between the houses, or groups of houses, which are built on an agreeable Russian peasant style, the grasses and wild flowers on the steppe grew with vigorous abundance, making a kind of like a thick lawn, which was nearly 3 feet high. These plants and grasses, which all turned brown at the end of summer, were scattered with enormous daisies and a variety of aromatic plants which the Russians collected for seasoning their food and preparing drinks. Fields of rough, light green gherkins were set off by enormous sunflowers. The groups of houses were inhabited either by members of a family or by friends who built in clusters to reduce the effort of paying visits. The Russians, especially the Ukrainians, are very gay and hospitable and ready to celebrate almost any occasion. I remember several pleasant gatherings at the homes of these enthusiastic people during which everyone managed to forget the rivalries of the war. And I remember the girls shouting with laughter when they had every reason to hate us. On another human scale altogether from the affected Parisian beauty, obsessed by her appearance and her cosmetics, each group of houses also had its own burial plot, which was never a sad place, but always a beautiful flowery pot with wooden tables where people sat and drank, and an ornamental signpost with an affectionate variation of the place name. Beautiful Aktirka, our town. Aktira the Great, sweet Aktirka. 4 days after our arrival, the second section of our group of volunteers joined us. It seemed they really had to sweat to make it. Almost the whole journey had been on foot. At last, on the 5th day, we took our places in the convoy for Nedrgailov. Our passes would not become operative until we reached Poznan, which was another 1,000 miles to the west. After that, there would be 600 miles to my parents in Wissembourg. I would therefore be traveling for several days. We drove across a huge expanse of country which was absolutely flat, without the slightest trace of hillock or hollow. Here or there we could see military tractors being used for agricultural work. We were able to maintain a decent speed as far as Nedrgailov, on a road which had been rebuilt by the army engineers, and which every 3 or 4 miles was littered with the wreckage of hastily abandoned Soviet material. We'd been driven for about 150 miles when our attention was attracted by some tiny shapes outlined against the distant sky. These black silhouettes were marked by little white clouds and the sound of explosions. The 2 trucks ahead of us slowed down and then stopped. As usual, the Feld responsible for the convoy jumped down from the first truck and stared through his field glasses. As usual, we waited for an order before plunging to the ground. Everyone was quiet, watching the Feld attentively, trying to fathom his reaction. Only the sound of the idling engine broke the stillness. The joy which had transformed our faces these last few days slowly faded as our anxiety grew. A few voices cursed our bad luck. I thought that by now we were good and far from all this trouble. God damn it! What do you think it could be? Partisans, muttered Hals, who had already taken part in a manhunt. There were several other conjectures as well. Whoever they are, I'm not going to let the bastards wreck my leave. I wonder what we're waiting for. Why don't they just tell us to go ahead and shoot them? Each of us had already picked up the Mauser rifle, which soldiers on leave in an occupied country were required to carry at all times. The idea that somebody or something might prevent us from going home made us feel savage. We were ready to shoot anyone at a moment's notice, if that's what was needed to keep moving west. But the order to fire never came. The Feld climbed back onto his truck, and the convoy started off again. We stared at each other in confusion. When some 500 yards further on, we ran into a group of 20 German officers carrying shotguns. We felt so surprised and delighted that our assumption had been mistaken that we cheered them as if they were driving past the Fuhrer himself. At last, we reached Niedergalow, where we left the convoy, which turned south. We went on to Romney, the gypsy paradise, where we were supposed to be picked up by another convoy moving west. At Niedergalow, our ranks were swelled by other men on leave from various parts of Russia until there were nearly 1,000 of us. However, the supply of available trucks had to be used for many purposes other than simply transporting men on leave. The few trucks for Romney took on about 20 fortunate souls. The rest of us were left to mill about in front of a field kitchen equipped to feed barely a quarter of our number. Although we were famished, we decided to walk the 30 miles to Romney and set off despite the lateness of the hour in the best of spirits. About 20 fellows who were considerably older than the rest of us and belonged to the Grossdeutschland division came along. There were also 7 or 8 fellows from the SS who sang at the top of their lungs. The others took swigs from bottles, which they passed from hand to hand. They must have emptied several cellars. Every one of them seemed to be carrying a generous collection. We had instinctively arranged ourselves in threes, as if we were going up to the line, and were proceeding on the double, consciously reducing the distance which separated us from Romney. Evening was slowly falling across the endless green, rolling landscape. Our uniforms, so perfectly matched to outdoor colors, seemed to take on the tone of the surrounding landscape, like chameleon skins. After the first 10 miles, our high spirits faded so much, leaving us more inclined to contemplate the immense panorama of the Ukraine. The earth, engaged in the process of spring germination, exhaled a subtle but nonetheless powerful odor as the horizon faded into the boundless emptiness of the darkening sky. Our uniforms grew darker as the earth darkened, almost as if by magic, and our footsteps seemed to be setting the rhythm of a whole mysterious universe. The blackness of night was spreading behind us, and we fell silent, hushed by the respect which immensity imposes on simple men. A group of soldiers, members of an army hated throughout the world, was seized by an indefinable emotion. As one sometimes jokes to hide sadness, we began to sing to avoid thought. The favorite song of the SS rose up like a hymn to the earth, offered to the men. So fight die Braune, heide geht, gehört das Ajes vier. Then darkness engulfed us, a darkness which, for the first time in months, seemed made for nothing more than watching over us. Although we'd been able to feel our exhaustion, no one suggested a halt. The road home was long, and we did not want to lose any time. For me, hoping to reach my other country, the road was even longer. Although our leave did not officially begin until Poznan, the idea of getting home override every consideration and enabled me to endure the painful condition of my bare feet, rubbed raw by my boots. Hals, who was having the same sort of trouble, cursed the storekeeper at Aktirka for failing to supply us with socks. After about 20 miles, we were forced to reduce our speed. Naturally, the veterans who had joined us and whose feet must have been made of iron treated us like crybabies. But they gave us their own socks so that we could go on. For a few of us, however, this was not enough. Our feet were too lacerated, and 3 additional miles we were able to manage cost us too much pain. As the rest of the group kept on despite our cries pleading for a halt, we decided to try walking barefoot on the dew grass. At first this seemed like an improvement, but not for long. Some even thought of wrapping their feet in the new undershirts we had been issued, but the possibility of an inspection made them hesitate. The last few miles, as we hobbled through the growing daylight, were torture. A torture refined by the first military police we met on the outskirts of Romney, who made us put back on our boots. They said they wouldn't allow us into town looking like a bunch of tramps. We could have murdered them. Further on, we asked some gypsies to take the worst cases as far as Commandante in their carts. They were prudent enough not to argue. The infirmary was on the same building as the Commandante. We even spoke with the commandant, who was outraged that soldiers from the Großdeutschland should have to go without socks. He sent an official statement of indignation to the Aktirka camp for failing to provide properly for new troops. Those who wished medical attention were sent to the infirmary, where their feet were washed in basins of warm water to which chloroform had been added. This had an extraordinary effect, easing our pain almost at once. We were each given a small red bottle box of cream for coating our feet before setting out on a march. But we still had no socks. Those of our group who had not gone to the infirmary were looking into the prospects for the rest of the journey. The Kharkov-Kiev line ran through Romney with daily trains in both directions. Our disappointment, therefore, was great when our two Feldwebels announced that we wouldn't be leaving for at least 2 days. All available space on trains moving toward the front was reserved for essentials, and on returning trains, emergencies were given priority over soldiers on leave. Rumors multiplied amongst our groups of 500 anxious men for whom each hour counted. People spoke of leaving for Kiev on their own, thumbing a ride on one of the convoys, sneaking onto a train on the quiet, or stealing some Russian horses. Some even spoke of doing the journey on foot, 150 miles, which would take at least 5 days, even with forced marches. All of these were really out of the question. We decided it would be better to just stay where we were. Old Hands groaned. I can tell you, we'll just sit here and watch our passes expire. We've got to get out of here. Who says we'll leave in 2 days? Probably be right. We'll be a week from now. So fuck the whole goddamn mess. I'm clearing out. My feet were still feeling too sensitive even to think about a march, no matter how pressing it might be. Hollis and Lenson were on the same state, so for better or worse, we had to wait in Romney without any idea of what to do or even where to sleep. The police were always after us, telling us to move on. It was useless to try to explain to them the bastards weren't interested. In the Ukraine, that paradise for troops on leave, they had rediscovered all the exasperating authority they exercised in peacetime. Anyone rash enough to argue with them risked having his pass torn up in front of his eyes. We saw this happen to one poor devil about 40 years old. The gendarmes kicked his pack like some sort of football, and the fellow remarked in an angry voice that he had just spent 6 months fighting in the Caucasus and felt entitled to a certain amount of common courtesy. "Traitors!" shouted one of the horrible cops. "Traitors who ran away from the Russians and lost Rostov. They should send the whole lot of you back to the front, which you never should have left in the first place." And he ripped the poor man's pass into shreds before his horrified eyes. We thought he would break down and just howl. Instead, he threw himself on the two cops, knocking both of them flat. He was gone before we could recover from our stupefaction. The furious cops picked themselves up, swearing to have the man shot. We took ourselves off in a hurry before they had the chance to turn their guns on us. 2 days later, we left for Kiev after all, crammed into a train which was also loaded with cattle. But we didn't care about traveling in comfort. We were interested in only getting to Kiev, which several months before its destruction was still a beautiful city. In Kiev, we felt that we had been saved, that the war no longer existed. The city looked beautiful, it was full of flowers. People were going quietly about their ordinary, everyday occupations. White streetcars edged on red moved through the brightly dressed civilian crowds of the pleasant town. Everywhere, troops in trim, brushed uniforms were walking with Ukrainian girls. I had already liked the look of the town in the winter. Now all my agreeable impressions were confirmed. I would gladly have ended the war right there. From Kiev, we had no trouble finding a train leaving for Poland. Our journey was vivid and colorful. We left in a crowded civilian train and mixed in this way with ordinary Russian people, had more of a chance to become acquainted with them than at any time during the war. Our train of oddly assorted carriages rolled for hours along a track that crossed the empty expanse of the Pripet marshes. The Russians, who drank and sang nonstop, offered drinks to all the soldiers too, and the noise through the journey was almost beyond belief. At the occasional station stops, people got on and off, and the most outrageous jokes were cracked amid shouts of laughter. The women made even more noise than the men. Hals put on a Gobarichka for a short time. We passed in this way from the Ukraine into Poland, arriving after 2.5 days in Lublin, Poland, where we had to change trains. In Lublin, there was also a meticulous police inspection. We were ordered to go to the camp barber for haircuts before departure. However, our anxiety about missing the train was so great that we decided to take what seemed to be an enormous risk, which succeeded. Hals, Lenson, and I managed to walk out past the military police with our hair untouched by any shears. This proved to have been a risk well worth taking, as without it we would surely have missed the train. We arrived at Poznan in the middle of the night and were received by a very efficient center. We were given tickets for the canteen and the dormitory and told to be at the office in the morning to have our passes validated. The office was open from 7 to 11, but we were warned to be there no later than 6 as usually there was a queue. This struck us somewhat strange. In effect, it meant that troops arriving in Poznan at 11:05 in the morning had to wait until the following day before they could continue their journey. I think this arrangement was probably motivated by a desire to keep men under army control even when they were theoretically on leave. In this way, a cancellation order could be sent east while the troops were waiting. By contrast, the order which processed returning troops was open 24 hours a day. We spent what was left of the night in a comfortable dormitory, which reminded me of the barracks at Chemnitz, and some of the office passes by 6 the next morning. There were already some 20 men ahead of us who must have spent the night on the spot, and by 7 there must have been at least 300. The self-important bureaucrats who ran the place took their own time verifying our documents while we stood in agitated silence. The police standing by the door were ready to cancel the leave of anyone foolish enough to lose their temper. When our papers had been stamped, we were sent across the courtyard into a large hall where our uniforms were inspected. We were given the opportunity to polish our boots and brush our clothes beforehand, and one might almost have believed that there was no mud in Russia. Then a final charming detail. Women soldiers distributed packages of choice foods wrapped in paper covered with eagles and swastikas inscribed, "A happy holiday to our brave soldiers." Sweet, sensitive Germany. Hals, who would have been capable of killing himself for a cup of beef broth, rolled his enormous eyes. If we'd only had something like this in Kharkov. We felt profoundly moved by these attentions. A package of sausages, jams, cigarettes, seemed generous repayment for our endless nights in the stone-cracking cold and our wanderings through the mud of the Don Valley. Hals and I set off for Berlin. Bearing our gifts, Lenzen left us to travel to his native Prussia. In Berlin, we were once again reminded of the war's existence. Around the Silesian station in the Weissensee and Pankow districts, many buildings had been reduced to rubble in the first stages of the city's destruction. But otherwise, the active, busy life of a capital metropolis went on as usual. In Berlin, which I was seeing for the first time, I was reminded of a promise I had made. I had promised myself to go see Ernst Naubach's wife. She lived with his parents in the southern part of the city. I explained this to Hals, who advised me to postpone the obligation until my return trip, but I knew very well that I would never be able to bring myself to leave home a day early, and that my parents would try to hang on to me until the last moment. Hals understood this, even though he had tried to persuade me to do something else. He didn't want to lose any time either, and left for Dortmund as soon as he could, making me promise to come see him. I would have done better to listen to the voice of wisdom speaking through my friend. My journey came to an end the next day in the flames of Magdeburg, and I had to stay in Berlin, a city entirely unknown to me where I had to work hard to make myself understood. Still carrying my pack and gun, which were beginning to feel very heavy, I set out to try to find the Naubach's house. Fortunately, I was still able to read the scribbled addresses I had found amongst my poor friend's papers. But should I try to get there by subway or bus? As I really didn't know where I was going, I decided to proceed on foot, which would at least give me the chance to look around. The idea of walking across the city still seemed normal at the time. However, I didn't really stray too far afield to walk west when I should have been walking south. I had noticed the sign Berlin Süd, which must be roughly correct. I passed two cops who gave me a long, cold stare when they noticed the spectacular package of a soldier on leave. I saluted them as required. One had to salute those bastards as if they were army officers, and went on my way. The city seemed beautiful, but serious and well organized. The bombing had only recently begun, and in Berlin affected only the districts immediately around the railway stations. In this large, imposing town with its austere houses set off by consumption, intricate railings. Everything seemed to be regulated by a precise, organized rhythm. No raucous crowds or parents pulling down their children's pants to let them pee. Men, women, children, bicycles, cars, trucks all seemed to be moving at an even, regular pace toward a precise destination, with a rhythm that seemed conscious and assertive and designed to avoid any dissipation of energy. It was all very different from Paris, for example. Undue haste seemed out of place, and my legs seemed to fall instinctively into the accepted tempo of the city. To stop moving without good reason would have seemed strange. The huge machine which the regime had set in motion for the cause was turning, and this was evident even in the gestures of the little old lady who was walking just ahead of me and whom I stopped to ask for directions. Her neat white hair was impeccable, like the streets and railings and edges of the sidewalks. The sound of my voice seemed to call her back from some distant daydream. "Excuse me, gnädige Frau," I said, feeling somewhat embarrassed, as if I were speaking in a theater where the play had already begun. "Could you give me some directions, please? I am going to this address." I showed her my scrap of paper, which really looked like something pulled out of a waste paper basket. The old lady smiled, as if she had seen an angel. "It's very far, young man," she said in a gentle voice, which suddenly reminded me of my childhood. "It's very far. You must go to the Tempelhof Autobahn, but it's really very far." That doesn't matter." I couldn't really think of anything else to say. "You really ought to take a bus. It would be much easier for you." "That doesn't matter," I repeated like someone in a dream. In fact, I couldn't think of a German word for anything else. This woman's obvious goodness, after so much loudmouth bullying and malignity, moved me even more deeply than the exhausted men of Alcheny. "I don't mind walking. I'm in the infantry," I finally said, smiling. "I know." she said, smiling even more tenderly than a moment before. You must be used to walking. I'll go with you as far as Schloss von Kaiser Wilhelm. From there, I'll be able to explain to you. She walked along beside me. As I didn't know what to say, the burden of the conversation fell onto her. Where have you come from, young man? From Russia. Russia's a big country. What part were you in? Russia's very big, yes. I was in the south, around Kharkov. Kharkov, she said, giving the name with a very German sound. I see. Is it a big town? Yes, it's big. For my kindly companion, Kharkov was clearly nothing more than a name which there was no particular need to remember. For me, Kharkov meant a city which had lost its life. If it had ever been a big town, it was now a heap of rubble, crowned by a cloud of dust, smoke, fire. It was also the sound of cries and moaning one shouldn't hear in towns. It was a long corridor of stiffened corpses we had to drag out into the air, and three Bolsheviks tied to a fence with their guts spilling from their bellies from the grenades we put in them. My son is in Bryansk, the old lady remarked, clearly hoping for news from the front. Bryansk, I repeated in a thoughtful tone. I believe that's in the central sector. I've never been there. He tells me that everything's going quite well. He's a first lieutenant in an armored division. A lieutenant? I thought. An officer? The opinions of a private soldier must have sounded ridiculous. Were things difficult in your sector? Things were pretty hard, but they're better now. I'm on leave, I added, smiling. I'm really happy for you, young man, she said, and her voice sounded as if she meant it. Are you in Berlin to see your family? No, geneigte Frau. I'm here to see the parents of a friend. A friend? Ernst. A corpse. What friend was I trampling along like this for? The old woman was beginning to get on my nerves. A friend from your regiment? She said, sharing my pleasure at being on leave. I felt like knocking her onto one of those intricate railway spikes. Where do your parents come from? From Weissenburg in Alsace. She looked at me with surprise. So you're Alsatian? I know Alsace very well. I almost told her that she knew it better than I did. Yes, I'm Alsatian, I said, hoping to get a little peace. She began to tell me about a trip she'd taken to Strasbourg, but I wasn't listening anymore. By forcing me to remember Ernst, she had irritated me. I had better things to do than listen to this old bird reminisce about her travels. It was a beautiful day. I was on leave, and I needed to see something gay. This desire made me wonder what attitude to take when I got back to the now box. These people had just lost their son, and were probably overwhelmed with grief. Maybe they didn't even know he was dead. If that's how it was, what on earth could I say to them? It would be better to visit them on the way back, but then they would surely have been told. Hals was right. I should have listened to him. He at least was still alive. We came to a crossroad opposite a bridge over a stream. Or even perhaps a large river. I knew that the Seine flowed through Paris, but couldn't have said whether Berlin was on the Elbe or the Oder. To the right there was a massive block of buildings, the Schloss von Kaiser Wilhelm, directly across the avenue of an impressive memorial to the heroes of 1914, 1,200 helmets of the time set round a forecourt to give some idea of the sacrifice of the First War. Two sentries from the Hitler's Guard walked around slowly back and forth along a cement apron at the base of the monument. Their slow, even pace seemed to me strangely symbolic of a human being slow-paced toward eternity, with the regularity which a master watchmaker might have envied. The two men executed impeccably synchronized half-turns, faced each other at a distance of 30 meters, resumed their march, crossed, turned, and began again. I found the spectacle somehow oppressive. Here we are, young man, the old woman said. You cross the bridge and follow that avenue. She pointed toward the vast, stony backdrop of the city, in which I would have had to find my address, but I had already stopped listening. I knew that I wasn't going to the Nährbox and that these explanations were superfluous. Nevertheless, I outdid myself in expressions of gratitude and pressed the old lady's hand. She withdrew, repeating her protestations of goodwill. I couldn't help smiling. As soon as she had disappeared, I rushed back in the direction from which we'd come, trying to make up for lost time and find the station for the west as quickly as possible. I walked along the riverbank with the obsessive speed of a maniac. Suddenly, the air filled with martial music, and an elegantly dressed military band marched out through the tall gateway and turned onto the street. I remembered what we were taught in Bialystok and snapped to attention, presenting arms to the indifferent troop. After an hour and a half with innumerable stops to ask my way, I arrived at the station from which trains left for the West and France. I looked desperately for Hals among the throngs of the platform. He would surely be on this train too, but I couldn't find him in the few minutes before departure. As I caught my breath on the train, the slow, regular progress of our acceleration seemed to merge with the measured tempo of the German capital. Everything here was so different from Russia. Even the soldiers had an air of seriousness which matched the civilized, organized life of large European countries. The contrast with Russia was so great that I wondered if what I'd seen there wasn't part of a bad dream. And that is 132, page 132, page 132 at the bottom, 132